Hisar Foundation and Engro Foundation, in association with TV1, News 1, Wasab and FM 91, presents the 5th Karachi International Water Conference webinar series on climate change and pandemic impact on water.
Hello to everyone and welcome to the inaugural session of the 5th Karachi International Water Conference. It's great to have everyone here. We have some wonderful speakers lined up to discuss the first session. We welcome all the participants and speakers to the session. The first session is Code Red for Humanity, the Climate Action Now. We have had the recent IPCC report by the UN released in August, and it presents a very grave situation that the world is facing. What we had promised and what we have delivered since the Paris Agreement, there's a big gap. And now with the recent COP26, which had a lot of hopes pinned on it, but there have been mixed reactions. There's a lot of disappointment from some of the island nations, some of the developing countries, but others are praising that at least something was signed. But we need to see what are the ways forward after this COP26. Will it be just another commitments which do not lead anywhere? Will it be more of the blah, 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 as Greta has recently said? So a lot of issues that are going to be discussed today, and I hope our speakers will be shedding light on it.
5वीं कराची इंटरनेशनल वाटर कॉन्फ्रेंस में सबको खुशामदीद। हमारे साथ बहुत ही मौजूद मेहमान मौजूद हैं। हमारे पहले सेशन में बात करने के लिए हम तमाम मेहमानों को अपने सेशन में खुशामदीद करते हैं। पहला सेशन है कोड रेड इंसानियत के लिए फौरी माहौलियाती अमल। हमारे पास यूएन की हालिया आईपीसीसी रिपोर्ट है और इससे हमें मालूम होती है वो सूरत हाल जिससे इस वक्त दुनिया गुजर रही है। जैसा कि हमने वादा किया था और जो हमने किया है इसमें बहुत फर्क है। और अब जो COP26 है जिससे कि बहुत सी उम्मीदें वाबस्ता थीं हमारे सामने है, मगर इस पर लोगों के मिले जुले तासुरात हैं। कुछ तरक्की पजीर ममालिक और कुछ जज़ायर की तरफ से खास मायूसी का इजहार किया गया है, मगर दीगर ममालिक इस बात पर खुश हैं कि कम अज़ कम ये शुरुआत हुई। मगर हमें देखना होगा कि COP26 आगे जाकर क्या करती है। क्या ये सिर्फ अज़ाइम ही होंगे जिनकी कोई सरबराही नहीं होगी, जैसा कि ग्रेटा ने किया था? तो बहुत से मसाइल पे आज हम बात करेंगे और मुझे उम्मीद है कि हमारे स्पीकर्स इस पर रोशनी डालेंगे।
Hisar Foundation is a foundation for water, food and livelihood security. We've been around since 2003. It's a thought leader and innovator. So the Karachi International Water Conference, let me tell you a bit about that. We started in 2013. The 5th Karachi International Water Conference is a series of 4 webinars instead of an in-person conference, and this is focusing on climate change and the pandemic and its impact on water. First one is Code Red for Humanity, which is this one. Second one is on circular water economy in an urban context. The third one is called Thinking the Unthinkable, harnessing the pandemic to improve SDG 6, health and sanitation. And the fourth one is on water and climate change, valuing women's leadership. We hope that you will be able to join us on all 4 of them.
हिसार फाउंडेशन पानी, ग़िज़ा और महफूज ज़रिए माश के हवाले से 2003 से काम कर रही है। KIWC 2013 में शुरू हुई। 5वीं KIWC कॉन्फ्रेंस 4 वेबिनार्स पर मुश्तमिल है और इस कॉन्फ्रेंस का मरकज़ है आलमी वबा और माहौलियाती तब्दीली और इसके पानी पर असरात। पहला है कोड रेड इंसानियत के लिए, जो कि ये है। दूसरा है आबी मईशत का दायरा और शहरी सयाक़ की रोशनी में। तीसरा है नाकाबिले तसव्वुर का तसव्वुर और चौथा है आबी और माहौलियाती तब्दीली, ख़वातीन क़यादत का तसव्वुर। हमें उम्मीद है कि आप इन चारों मौज़ूआत पर हमारे साथ रहेंगे।
I'll just lay out how this session will be conducted. We have 2 plenary speakers in the beginning. Then there will be a Q&A session. And afterwards, we have 5 invited speakers, followed by another Q&A session, and then a conclusion of the session. So without further ado, and moving on to the excellent speeches and talks that we have lined up, I would like to introduce our first speaker. It is Dr. Adil Najam.
मैं आपको बताता चलूं ये सेशन कैसे मुनक्किद किया जाएगा। हमारे पास शुरू में 2 स्पीकर्स हैं, फिर सवालात और जवाबात का सिलसिला होगा और इसके बाद हमारे 5 मजीद स्पीकर्स हैं, जिसके बाद फिर से सवालात और जवाबात का सिलसिला होगा और फिर इख्तिताम होगा। तो मजीद वक्त ज़ाया किए बगैर मैं दावत दूंगा अपने पहले स्पीकर डॉक्टर आदिल नजम को।
I won't focus on the climate COP. I'm a veteran and very much wounded veteran of the COPs. I was at every COP from the very first one until Copenhagen, after which I kind of put a ban on myself from getting to more blah blah, if you will. But I don't want to go there. In some ways, my hopes are not with the COP process, which is really that we need to start thinking not just about water, but about climate in a way that is different from the compartmentalized technocratic way that I've spent my life talking about it. And because these boundaries that are artificial in the first place between issues were not very relevant in the beginning, but they made at least intellectual sense, and they are now no longer making either intellectual or policy sense. Because we are living, as I will argue, in the age of adaptation. What does that mean? I want to talk about 3 questions, as I often do. Let me throw 3 questions that are going to frame what I want to talk about. First is not what the COP is telling us, but what is the climate telling us? And in some ways, I think, to use the Urdu phrase, hum is COP ki lal batti ke piche lag gaye. The question is not what came out of the COP. The question is what is coming out of the global climate. Because the COP becomes irrelevant in front of those very real forces of nature and what they are telling us, and I want to talk about that. The second question that I want us to think about as we think about this question, second is, what does it mean to live in the age of adaptation? And the third is, which is what I want to focus on, how do we think about water in this age of adaptation? I'm going to do this by trying to tell you a story that was increasingly, which is a story that is really about climate change, but it is being increasingly told in the language of water. And I would argue that this causes a challenge, not only for people who work on climate, who are like me, or who have essentially been telling their story in the language of carbon, but it also poses a challenge for people who work on water, because that story is also going to be changed by climate. Let me start with where we are after the COP. And where we are after the COP, if we start looking at the COP, is really where we were before the COP. The COPs, in many ways, the climate negotiation process has become a permanent negotiation process that rejigs the same conversation, creates a hype of hope as if something big is going to happen. So when COVID came, in a week, China found not 100 billion, but $1 trillion. US found another $1 trillion, spent it in 1 week, found another $1 trillion. The EU found $1 trillion, right? These were numbers we were not used to. And why do I mention that? I mention that because what happened is we saw what happens when people actually believe what they are saying. When people actually feel threatened, the money comes in. And the point I'm trying to make is this demonstrates again that the rhetoric on climate, or on water, but certainly on climate, is rhetoric. And that is why these numbers sound so big when they are in fact not as big as we make them sound, as was demonstrated by COVID. I'll come to that in a minute. The second big number that came, and I'll repeat what I've said earlier, in fact, was between 1.5 and 2. That is where the climate was supposed to be stabilized. That was already an abdication of the original climate agreement, which was back in 1991. The idea was that there wouldn't be human-induced atmospheric change in carbon concentrations or a climate change. By Paris, they had said, okay, let's try to keep it below 2 and possibly 1.5. No one was serious about 1.5. And the last time I spoke to you, I pointed out that scientifically, there is now nearly no option of reaching 1.5. I don't know a single serious scientist who believes it will be done. Can it be done? Yes, with sort of impossibility type policies. But it is nearly it's known now that this won't be achieved. In a way, I'm tempted to put a simple single cross again on 2.0, because now it seems that because we haven't been doing mitigation, meaning reducing emissions, 2 is also now nearly certainly a scientific impossibility. And that means we are living in a world where you should expect a change, certainly above 1.5 and possibly much more. And that is what I call the age of adaptation. Now, we have gone through 2020. I'm going to do this for 2020, not 21. And you have heard about 1,000 times that 2020 was a year like no other. And usually by that, people mean, haha, we were all on Zoom, having the type of troubles that I was having a minute ago. But let me tell you the story of 2020, not in the language of COVID, but what else was happening while we were busy with COVID, because nature doesn't really take it as seriously as the rest of us do. This is what 2020 was really like. And you've seen this on your headline, you may not have noticed. And the point here, I can go into 2021 and tell you July that we just finished was the hottest July ever recorded, any month ever recorded. The point that nature and climate is telling us is that the COP is increasingly irrelevant. The climate is changing. It's not waiting for an agreement to be implemented. The climate isn't waiting out there for us to get our act straight. Point here is that the signal from the climate is that we are now in the age of adaptation. This is no longer a future issue. This is a current issue, and that's not a slogan. I'm not just trying to make a slogan. What I'm saying is that means that we have to prepare and act, not just prepare, but act for a world in which the climate is changing. That by my back of the envelope calculation, about 2.5 billion people in the world, many of them in Pakistan, not everyone, are facing climate change today. And we are still talking about climate policy as if it is a policy for the future. Right? And again, my slides have stalled, so I won't go into that at all now. But the point there is that if you look at the actual data, what we are seeing is that climate is changing, and that climate change is manifesting itself, whether it is in heat waves in Karachi, whether it is in fires in Australia, whether it is in what is happening in Europe, whether it is happening with floods across South Asia, whether it is happening in Latin America, we are now seeing the manifestation. Now, there might be people here who are saying, Professor, that is fine, but we've had floods before and we've had heat before, and you can't prove which part of this is climate. No, I can't. But what I can prove, and what the science has been saying all along, is that climate is not going to create new challenges or new climate events. What it is going to do is two things, and it is doing that now. One, it changes the amplitude, right? How strong each of these climate events is. And second, it changes the frequency. How frequent are those? When your 30-year flood becomes your 15-year flood, and when your 15-year flood becomes your annual flood, that is what it means to have the climate changing. The point there is then, if we are in the age of adaptation, what does that mean? My contention on water is in particular that one of the most important implications of the age of adaptation is that in the age of adaptation, climate changes from a carbon-focused enterprise to a largely but not entirely water-focused enterprise. And what does that mean? What that means is, if you think about our climate discussion, that is primarily has been focused on carbon. Why? Because you want to mitigate, you want to reduce the likelihood of climate changing. How do you do that? You do that by reducing emissions. What are emissions about? Mostly about carbon, not entirely. Once you are fixated on carbon, you immediately get fixated on energy policy, which is why climate discussions immediately start focusing a lot on energy policy, because they should in the age of mitigation. How does that change in the age of adaptation? It changes in the age of adaptation because in adaptation mode, in the world that I'm describing, climate is no longer only about, it still is about, but it is no longer only about reducing emissions, it is about dealing with impacts, right? And if you're talking about climate impacts, then the question is, think about what the impacts are. They're not about carbon molecules, right? They're about what the carbon molecules do once they're in the atmosphere. So what are the climate impacts? A lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them are about water. And that is why climate adaptation is a water game. Think about it again. If you've heard it, I'll say it again. What happens when climate changes? Amongst the things that happens are water rises, sea level rises, water melts, glaciers, water disappears, drought, water falls from the sky like no one's business, extreme events, floods. And what that means is that the locus of climate impacts, the language in which many of them are written, is the language of water. And that is the logic of climate adaptation changing in the world of adaptation. And that really is the most sort of central message. Now, what happens when that happens? In a way, you can think about it simply as, water availability, not availability, but it's not that. What it is much more profound than that. Then you are talking about issues of health and disease.